Okay, let's get started. Welcome. Today I'm going to talk about research ethics. Usually I only talk about the human subject side, but this time Michelle asked me to cover something more broadly. First, let me introduce myself. Okay, I'm Luke Zhang. I'm an associate professor here, and I'm in HCI SIG. You guys know SIG, right? Special interest groups. We have several SIGs in IST. We have computational informatics, social informatics, human-computer interaction, security, and privacy, so on and so forth. Okay, and I'm directing the knowledge visualization lab, and my research pretty much about visualization, human-computer interaction. Okay. So my background, and I have grown up with the iSchool movement. I saw someone, Okay, you guys come here, you know what iSchool is, right? I'm the first group of students in Michigan, when Michigan and Syracuse and other universities began to pursue this iSchool movement, okay? And of course, in the beginning, it's just kind of experiment, it's risky. That's why in my class, we only had 5 students. Not here, right? The cohort here probably 20, 30 something. Now Michigan is getting, also a PhD program is growing, but in the beginning we only have 5, and actually only 2 finished. The other 3 actually dropped out. But now it's totally different stories, okay? So right now my research focus is on information visualization and the visual analytics, pretty much on the visual analytics side. And right now I'm working on some project related theoretical foundations of visual analytics, such as what kind of analytical processes people actually indeed go through, and then how we can use visualization to help. In addition to that, I'm also doing research on CSCW, collaboration technologies, and also mobile user interface. My PhD thesis was about virtual reality, so now virtual reality becomes hot again. So someone began to approach me to see whether we can do something related to that. Okay, I will see. Into my teaching, I'm teaching both graduate and undergraduate courses. For graduate courses, I'm teaching 505. How many of you are master students? Okay, so I'm pretty sure you will see me in that class. And I also teach 526, which is informational visualization and visual analytics. I taught 590 early on, curriculum for PhD students. And so, but not recently. For many of you, you may do TA in the future. So I'm teaching 220, which is a course on network, and SRA 468, which is visual analytics. Some of you may work with me in the future. Okay, pretty much this is about myself. So. I joined IST in 2005. I graduated from Michigan in 2003, and I worked in University of Arizona for 2 years. Okay, it took me 7 years to finish my PhD. Okay, I hope you guys don't have spent that much time, but who knows? Okay, we can talk about it later if you have any questions. Okay. Okay, as I said, research ethics sort of very broad. And pretty much in general, it's about what kind of the practices we can support, what we should do. What happened? Okay, yeah. She was in my class, so I know her. Okay. And so, what you should do and what you should not do. Okay, and they're pretty simple, right? And very often we can use our common sense and make a good judgment. And what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. But sometimes that's not easy. That's why, in addition to use our common sense, judgment, self-regulation, we also need certain policies, institution enforcement to help you guys understand what should be done, okay? So, what are they? So, I just listed here, okay? Somehow, you can think about the scope. Of course, data integrity. When you do the research, you need the data. Data integrity is a very important issue. And authorship, when you need to write a paper with your lab mates, with your advisors, right? And so who should be on the list, who should not. And when you finish your research, you want to put it somewhere, or you want to let people know how you disseminate your research. Of course, publication is a very important part of your life, right? And what you should do, right? And also, nowadays, pretty much, you cannot do the research by yourself. You have to collaborate with each other. What kind of issues you should be aware of when you're collaborating with people. In particular, nowadays, your collaborators may not be just inside ISD. They may be in other countries, right? And that becomes very complicated, right? And so you work with your advisor, what kind of relationship and you should be aware of. Also, you are going to be TA and you are going to mentoring other people. So how you can maintain the relationship professional. And you will review papers, or your papers will be reviewed. And there are also some kind of ethical issues involved, okay? And of course, and very important part is that, well, most of you are going to deal with the human subject when you collect the data, right? And there are some very serious ethical conducts and we should be aware of, okay? Today, pretty much, I will use half of the time talk about, a lot of things, and then I will spend the other half talk about human subject, okay? And the last part is so-called the fiscal responsibility. It does not concern you directly. Pretty much it's about your advisor, other people inside the IST who provide financial support to you. But it's always a good idea for you to understand what kind of university policies have on us. And then, when you need to deal with the advisor, such as you want to get some travel money, can you use money? And your advisor says, oh, well, I cannot give you, oh, he or she has money, why I cannot get it? So there are certain issues, okay? Anyway, so Penn State has a policy here. It's called RAG 16, right? Responsible Conduct of Research. And pretty much you can read through the whole, this is a new use interface. So you can see, a lot of things. I took some, pretty much the categories I took from here, right? But I like to, use my personal experience and lessons to discuss certain important things. You guys can read this by yourself later. Okay, the guiding principle pretty much here is that, well, when we do research, we want to create new knowledge, we want to advance our understanding of the people, of the world, but we need to follow certain guidance, right? And you guys have seen a lot of movies, right? There are mad scientists, they want to do anything to get, somehow kind of scientific significant results, right? But we know, well, usually you should not, somehow to advance your discovery at the expenses of other people's benefits, right? Somehow we need to make sure in the ways of pursuing scientific discovery, you need to maintain certain integrity and professionalism, okay? And you need to be fair, right? And to the people, and to your advisor, to the people, to the students. And somehow, you need to be aware of the potential conflicts of interest, either financial or personal, okay? And nowadays in particular, when we do research, pretty much we need a lot of money, right? And very often we got the sponsors to give us the money. And then the question would be, well, you got money, should you always say something in favor of sponsors or not, right? And for the government agencies, you don't have to worry about this. But for the company sponsors, there's always kind of the question, okay? I talk about this. And so when we deal with human subject, we need to look at their benefits, right? fundamentally, we need to be aware of the regulations, laws, and the policies. Anyway, so eventually you want to make sure your research can be verified and can be tested by other people, and all aspects can be held up, okay? And nowadays, it's starting from data collection all the way to the writing, publication, and everything becomes so open. It's so easy for people to find any wrongdoing if there's any, okay? That's why it's very important for you guys to know the ethical issues. Now, first, let's look at the data integrity. This is very important stuff, okay? We all know this. I just want to tell you some kind of very high-profile stories later, okay? Pretty much it's about how you collect data, how you preserve data, and then, how you, dispose the data in the future when the data is no longer useful to you, okay? So we know, of course, the collection of data, you need to have kind of the well-designed research procedures and collect data, objectively, right, without any change, right? Store data, privacy, so on and so forth. And later today, we'll talk about the user privacy, in particular in ISD. Part of research is about human information privacy. So for you guys, you got to be very careful about the data privacy. You got to make sure the data collected and will not be reviewed to other parties, and privacy of the subject will be violated, okay? Yeah, we also talk about whenever you finish your study, usually we want to make the data available to the scientific communities. Several years ago, I remember I went to a conference pretty much organized by iSchools, and they talk about one extreme approach. Basically, they are saying, whenever you submit a paper to a journal, when the paper is published, you need to provide all your data to put the data in the central server of the journal, and then all other people who are interested can download data to see what's going on. It's called Open Data Initiative, right? And right now, NSF has kind of data management plan whenever you write a proposal. Pretty much they want to make sure your data can be easily accessed. But that's not always the case, okay? Recently, there are some news stories about very, very interesting scientific discovery, but cannot be duplicated in other labs. And then they want the data, but the authors said, well, we cannot provide the data, okay? That's why somehow you need to make sure and the data should be, preserved in a way which can reflect the initial states, like raw data, how initial data was collected, in what kind of format, right? Also, you need to keep it long enough. Later, when we talk about certain cases, and it's interesting, some people say, well, our raw data was lost. Some people think videotape was stolen, some stories about, and lab logs were eaten by rats, right? All kinds of stories, right? So anyway, so probably you guys know it's kind of very high-profile cases regarding the kind of data fabrications, right? And the three very famous ones, and one is very recent. The other two probably a bit longer. The first guy, Huang Wu-Suk, and he did research on cloning, right? He cloned the dog, basically. It turns out, and his research data was fabricated, right? The second guy, and Yan Sheng, right? Well, he was a superstar at the Bell Lab. And so at one point, he had one paper every 8 days. It's not just in regular places. Pretty much his papers are in Science, Nature, this kind of venues, right? Turns out all his data is fake, right? Of course, recent story is about this lady, right? A Japanese researcher who did her research in Harvard Medical School in stem cell research, Haruko Obukata, right? Turns out her research is also fabricated, right? And so these are pretty much our science areas, biology and physics, right? And you may say, well, how about in other areas? Well, concern us, and probably these two guys are more close to some research in our college. The first guy, Stapel, is a Dutch professor. He fabricated all kinds of data, including his thesis in social psychology. Okay, it's a very high-profile case. He was the dean of a college in Europe before he was asked to step down. Okay, the other guy, Mark Hauser, is a professor in Harvard, right? And this is a guy who said his original videotapes was stolen from the basement, right? And so this kind of cases all the time whenever we talk about the data integrity. You can see here, right? It's not just the regular guys, right? Students or, postdoc or research scientists. They are professors, pretty much. They're very, very senior, right? They still cannot resist the temptation to fabricate data. And this guy later wrote a book regarding his experience. I remember in his book he said, it's so easy to make fake data, right? So easy also, and people trust him. Usually people do not verify the integrity of data, okay? Anyway, so you guys be very careful about the data stuff, okay? So the question here is that, well, when you do the research, what you can do to preserve data integrity, right? In the case of the Harvard professor, actually some students, and also in the Dutch guy's research, some of his postdocs found out the kind of irregular data, but they did not question him, okay? So, from my point of view, for you guys, and when you collect data, when you produce results, if you see something somehow different from what you have in the paper that will be submitted or something, you got to be very careful to look at who did the following data analysis and how the image was produced, right? If there's any discrepancy between the results you see and the data you have, make sure you should have a certain evidence, right? Such as you send an email to your advisor asking what's going on, just in case in the future your advisor or some people say, oh, I didn't do that, my student did that, okay? So somehow you need to be aware of this kind of the potential practices and protect yourself, okay? Any question about data integrity? I think it is very simple issues, right? You don't have to worry about it too much. Okay, now let's move on. I got fairness in authorship. I'm pretty sure sooner or later, you guys have to deal with this matter. Okay, pretty much is that, well, I wrote the paper, or I contribute the project, right? And the publication is ready, right? Should I be the first author? Should I be the second? Or should I be a correspondence author? Or who should be on the list of authors, right? So you may have to deal with faculty members like your advisors or your, other professors in ISD or other department, and supporting staff who may provide you the help, right? Or even students who do the coding stuff for you. So pretty much, you have to evaluate, okay, whose contribution is significant enough to make the author list, right? Otherwise, you can just acknowledge the contributions at the end of the paper. And usually it's not easy. And as a student, the best practice is to leave the decision to an advisor, okay? And in IST, at least based on my understanding, the assignment of authorship in IST is quite fair usually. I have never heard anything very out of line, okay? In other places, like in Arizona, other places, I heard some interesting stories, right? But in IST, we have not seen anything like that yet. But this is something you should be aware of, okay? So just in case, you need to take a lead in deciding who should be on the author and the list, the order, and you need to look at, what kind of roles they have played, and then decide the order. So first author, co-first author, so on and so forth, okay? In ISD, we don't have, at least I didn't hear any sort of lab rules regarding, how the order should be decided. In certain areas I know, for example, in physics, the authors may, how many, like 1,000 authors in one project. In other places, maybe dozens, right? So the best way to solve the contribution issue is that, well, we just have a universal rules, right? Such as alphabetically, right? But in ISD, we don't have that. I heard one interesting case, one lab in chemistry department, not here, another university. The professor said, well, in the lab, all the papers must be, alphabetically ordered, right? Turns out his last name is Aaron, right? So he's always the first author. So I thought that's smart. I should have another rule, all reverse alphabetically, and then I will always be the first author. Anyway, and so usually this kind of the conflicts can be easily resolved. Okay, and in particular as a student, I think probably if you have certain disagreement, you need to think about sometimes you may not see the whole project, the whole picture, right? Your advisor got a sponsorship from other places, may get some help from other places, and probably you do not have the big picture. If you have concerns, make sure you talk to other people and to see what's going on, okay? I heard certain cases in ISD students that disagree with authors' assignment, authorship, and then became kind of angry, okay? It does not have to be like that. Okay. Another thing you be aware of that whenever you list someone as a co-author, right? You make sure you should let the person know before you submit the paper. Don't wait for the last minute and say, okay, our paper is accepted and you are one of the co-authors, right? That's a very bad practice. In particular, for senior person, okay? If somebody asks me that, I usually say, no, don't do that. I will not be listed as the co-author because I don't know what is in the paper. The paper is already accepted, right? You cannot say, well, I need to re-look at the data analysis method, I need to look at raw data, everything. So somehow they don't have time. But the risk is that if you put a name there, if something went wrong in the future, you'll be also responsible, right? You cannot say, okay, I'm just honorary author. I have no role in any research. That's not a good excuse, right? Okay, suppose you have multiple authors in the beginning, you need to make sure everyone knows responsibility. In particular in ISD, probably you will have someone writing code, someone, do the experiment, someone write the paper, right? And somehow, and you may hear some advisor say, who never writes the paper will be the first author. You may feel unfair. No, I did the whole project. I wrote the whole codes, right? The 20,000 line codes. Why I cannot be the first author, okay? So that's why you need to be aware of the responsibility. Sometimes programming is just one step of one part of the whole research, right? It's important, but it's not the whole. I mentioned this already. Avoid honorary authorship. But this is something probably sometimes you cannot control. Suppose your advisor got the data from someplace else, right? That data is very difficult to get somehow. And they only have one condition. Well, they want to work with you together and then become part of the publication. Sometimes those people who are involved are indeed interested in helping you writing a paper. And they will read the paper and give you the feedback. But sometimes people just, okay, I don't care as long as you put my name there, okay? So, the word is imperfect. You can see all kinds of the honorary authors, somehow. It's inevitable sometimes, but that's not good practice. Suppose in the future you become a PI, you become university professor, and I want you to know right now, so somehow to avoid that kind of the practice, okay? Of course, usually you need to make sure you should declare the so-called in the financial sponsor or statement, make sure people know where you get money from. Okay, suppose you did. I mean, this is just hypothetical example. Suppose the researcher does the research on cigarettes, right? And then he got money from a cigarette company. And it's his responsibility to declare the financial support in the acknowledgement section, so people know. Well, and there's certain issues going on. Okay. Okay. So I mentioned this already. So as a student, pretty much, and your how to put that way, somehow your decision on authorship is very limited. Okay. And it really depends on advisors. Sometimes advisors want to discuss with you, but sometimes when you send him or her your manuscript, what you get back is a kind of revised order list without any explanation. Okay, and so you need to know the style of your advisor. That's something I'll talk about later. In my case, I remember in my first paper, I worked as RA for my advisor. After 1.5 years, we decided to write the paper, and then my advisor said, okay, now let's talk about authorship, right? Only 2 of us, so it's just a matter of who would be the first author. So, of course, and he talked about, the research design as a whole and my role. To be fair, that paper, what I did, it's just the coding, right? I have no idea what he's trying to do, so it's very easy to decide who is the first author, okay? But when you progress to your senior years, somehow before your graduation, and things can be very complicated because very often at that point, the research becomes your own project. Your contribution probably the most significant ones, right? In that sense, you have to discuss with advisor. Probably you can take a more active voice, okay? The tricky part here is that some of you may in a bigger group, somehow probably several people are involved, right? And then in certain places, there are practice that everyone can get a part of the authorship. So that's a norm, right? And do you want to break the norm or not? That's up to you, okay? I can just tell you one thing, and the downside of that practice. Several years ago, 2 persons from the same lab, a very famous MIS department, applied for jobs, right? They too were interviewed by some same departments. Surprisingly, their publications are so similar because in that group, the practice, everyone is on the author list, okay? It's just a matter of who is the first author in this paper, who is the second author on that paper. So that 2 persons, almost exactly the same paper, but the only difference, some of the papers first authored by first person, some are authored by the second person, okay? And I happen to know both of them, and so they told me it's very hard for them to explain, right? Because in MIS, somehow they went to another department which is different from MIS. Culturally, it's very different, okay? For example, think about in physics, right? Like 100 people in one paper, how do you claim your contribution, right? And for people like us, it's very difficult to understand. But inside the physics, they don't have to discuss this because they know you cannot research without help of other people. So it doesn't matter, how to allocate the credits. Everyone has to do that, right? Okay, so let's move on in terms of submission. This is something I think is very important for you guys to know why you submit your papers, right? Of course, you need to provide enough information so people can evaluate and judge the quality of research to see whether contribution is significant. But more importantly, you guys should remember, so no double submission or sometimes the triple submissions, right? And in particular, in certain areas, there are so many conferences and similar conferences. The deadlines are very close, or sometimes like the deadline, for the notification somehow is after the deadline of the submission of another conference. So what do? Wait for the wait for the results, and you may miss the deadline, and then you may take a risk to submit another paper, okay? So, so here, my advice is don't do that, okay? That's part of the risk. And I mean, what I mean risk is that you do not submit a paper and your paper may be rejected, so you miss the deadline. This kind of risk is part of the academic life, okay? If you want to do the simultaneous submission, you should know, well, you know, scientific communities are very small. Very often, your papers may be reviewed by the same people. And they will see, well, you know, the double submission, right? And that's really bad for your reputation as well as for your advisors, right? And then you may be on the blacklist, right? And in the future, you may encounter more problems than just missing one paper, okay? Another issue is that following the guidelines of submission. And this is something students usually are not quite aware of in the beginning. When you submit the paper, and you just, you know, write the paper and then submit online. For every journal and conference, they have their own templates, certain guidelines should be followed, such as in citation format, you know, appendices, other things, right? And make sure you follow the guidelines. The reason is that, you know, I'm an associate editor of a journal, right? When I look at the submission sometimes, in particular those which do not follow the guidelines. And so the impression of the quality of your responsibility and even your attitudes goes down dramatically, okay? And that can affect the decisions of your final outcome. So make sure, right? In particular nowadays, it becomes so easy to change a format and other things by following guidelines, right? If you're using LaTeX, that's even easier. You change the template and then you change the format easily. Another thing is that be aware of the conflict of interest of reviewers. And now you guys may not be, it's not necessary for you guys to think about this yet, but later you may find some kind of the interesting things. Some people who do not like your research at all, probably they are the enemies of your advisors, or they don't like you. Or, you know, you want to say, okay, you know, I can ask my friends to be reviewers, okay? So nowadays, and actually it's quite difficult to find the reviewers, right? For example, you submit the journal paper, probably took 2 months to find the reviewers, right? That's why usually journals like you to provide a name or names of potential reviewers, right? But in this case, you should not provide the names of your friends or who you may think do a returning favor for you. But of course, you can say, I don't want my paper to be reviewed by certain people, right? That's a fair practice, but you do not want to ask your friends to review your papers, right? Of course, reviewers or editors, they cannot know whether you're friends or not. But if the quality of the paper is not good enough and your friend is doing you a favor, but other reviewers judge your paper fairly, and they can clearly tell the discrepancy of the ratings. For example, for a paper I just recommended, right? And so 3 reviewers, 2 basically is the major revision, right? Somehow the fundamental issues, but the other reviewer received the asset, right? Somehow you can tell that reviewer is recommended by the authors, right? So that's also very bad practice, okay? In terms of dissemination of research, pretty much here is bad. Well, you want to let people know your research, right? What do you do? And this is very special in Penn State. In Penn State, we have a research lab called Applied Research Lab. You guys know this, right? Probably some of you guys know this. And pretty much, and the research project in that lab are classified. And you know, I'm a Chinese citizen. I cannot even be in that lab. Once they schedule a conference, schedule a meeting in that lab, I said, no, don't go there. I said, no problem. This is no classified issue at all. As soon as I stepped into the lobby, I sign up. They look at the citizenship. No, that's as far as you can come. Go back to where you're from. Okay. Anyway, so in ISD we have many projects actually probably relate to the ARM. So in that sense, not only you need to properly get the security clearance, more importantly, you should maintain the secrecy of the research project. Don't share your research with other people, okay? If you have certain proprietary information, such as you got the data from hospital or something, right? And you pretty much, your advisor may sign the agreement with other parties. And you should make sure the data can be preserved, okay? And one of my students who worked in IBM research once told me they got the data from a company, right? And the confidentiality requirement is very high. So the data can only be accessed in that particular room, in that particular machine. So basically, the machine was not online, and they can look at the data by going there to do some kind of algorithm and then come back. So they need to bring the algorithm to the machine with the data, right? Rather than you can download the data. So nowadays, pretty much, the proprietary information is one of the sort of the secret weapons for the companies. Sometimes they're really tight regarding this. Okay. Another issue about intellectual property, in particular nowadays, you guys know probably, since intellectual property is so important. Places like Penn State, we are very, very tight regarding protecting our intellectual properties, right? And in certain departments like biology, chemistry, they have to go through certain processes before they publish their papers. But in ISD, usually it's not that case. You can publish your papers, and within 1 year, you can file a certain document, and then university IP office will look at your stuff and decide whether they want to file a patent or not. Because filing a patent is very, very expensive, so they want to make sure every filing is worthy, right? So, and in computer science, it's not about, it's not like other places. People get the formula and then the patent is not useful, right? But in computer science, like even you publish a paper within 1 year, you still can file your patents. And so inside the Penn State, that's one thing, but going to a company, suppose you guys are going to do the internship in places like Google, you will encounter totally different practice, right? And this is what I was told by the Google researchers. They have to submit the paper to their lawyers, internal lawyers, before they submit to the conference or journals. And the lawyers will look at. And the lawyers, actually, they are very knowledgeable and to decide what information should be removed, right? That's why in many Google's paper, if you look at carefully, you cannot get the total information. You can get a part of information, right? Sometimes the figures themselves are not complete. Sometimes units are missing and scales are not appropriate. Well, they can tell a story, but you cannot get the true story, okay? Another thing is about export control. Right now, Penn State and the whole country actually are very, very serious about that things. In particular, nowadays, international travels are very, very abundant, right? And our faculty members actually are required to get a special laptops if we travel to another country. So, and of course, personal computers are another case, but you have your Penn State computers. Usually, it's good advice to get something from university, and so you don't have to worry about research data or other things may be hacked. Okay, also your phones, other things, right? Another thing is that how you are going to disseminate your papers that have been published by journals or the conferences. Okay, we call this copyrighted papers. And usually when you publish your papers, you have to sign a piece of paper. You transfer copyrighted paper to the journals or the conferences like ACM, IEEE, right? That means you are not supposed to put that paper on your website. You cannot do that because that means people can download that copyright material free, right? So this kind of conflicts. For researchers like us, we want to disseminate the kind of knowledge as broadly as possible. But you also need to understand the financial interests of the publishers. Okay, what do you do? Can you guys think about what's the practice usually?
The DOI line. Post the DOI line.
DOI, okay. DOI, that's a very good approach. Somehow you put a link over there, right?
Author edition.
Author edition, right? So preprint.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually you can put a preprint, which means it's not the final version, slightly different from the other published version on your personal website. Okay, and I also know some people have this kind of practice. When they sign the agreement, they just cross out those items that put the constraint on the papers where they put their personal website. Usually, publishers will not argue with you too much, just one person's case, okay? But usually you can just have a preprint version on your website. So nowadays, so this is something I certainly disagree with the journals of those practices. It's become so expensive, right? It's not just a charge for readers. And those journals charge us a lot. It's become so expensive to subscribe digital databases, right? And we pay millions of dollars, right? Basically, think about this. They use your papers to make money, okay? What they do, they organize conferences. And actually, for every conferences they organize, usually they never lose money. They can always make a profit. So basically, if you have money, you can just open such a publishing house, running the conferences. Guarantee you can have very good profit. Okay. The last thing here is that, well, sometimes our research, maybe I put the harmful here. I should put a quotation mark. Harmful to certain people or to certain company, organization, right? For example, you find out a certain security loopholes, right? What do you do? Are you going to publish on the web or not, right? And that loopholes can be abused by hackers, right? So, and you can think about the other similar research, right? When you do security, or somehow, and you need to be aware of this, okay? Okay, peer review. Yeah, it's pretty much similar to what I said. Somehow, you need to be aware of the conflict of interest first, right? And usually you don't want to review papers of your friends. Somehow you don't want to let your friends review your papers. So, as I said, the world is imperfect. We want to have this kind of the ideal environment, but in reality, that's not the case, right? You can, in different disciplines, you can hear all kinds of stories, right? Another thing is that sometimes you are asked to review certain papers or grants when you become a senior, like and so sometimes you got papers which are not quite your expertise, right? And sometimes you got requests from very good journal. The temptations that, well, I reviewed the paper and then I became part of the journal reviewer process. Eventually I become the editor or something, right? But be aware of your expertise. If you do not have the knowledge, don't do that, right? Another important thing when you review papers or proposals is that you should know to keep the information confidential, right? And not just the authors who write what, right? More importantly, it's about the contents. In particular for the grant proposals, right? And your NSF grants, when you're on a panel, you will review 30 grants. There are some very fancy ideas, fantastic ideas, right? And of course, not all proposals can be funded. So the question here that, well, how do you treat those unfunded project, right? And so early on, we heard stories that certain panelists actually steals ideas of the proposals from young people, right? Okay, but this is not good. Okay. Okay, so I'm pretty sure sooner or later, in particular for PhD student, you have this kind of situation. Your advisor may say, okay, this is a paper we need to review. Give me the result in 3 or 5 days. What will you do? Do you think it's ethical or unethical practice? Or have you ever encountered this kind of issue? No, not ready yet. Okay. Okay, so the answer is it really depends. Okay, it depends on what kind of situation, which year are you. So one of my students, usually one of my students in their first year or second years, I indeed ask them to review a paper, but usually I pick up those papers, which I think probably can help them understand the topics, right? And then to let them practice their review skills, right? But I don't use their review comments. Basically, I just say, well, look at this paper and tell me what do you think, right? And then we will discuss this. But sometimes when you are in your third year, fourth year, probably last year, your advisor may not have time. Oh, give you a paper, review the paper, okay? So, and the question here that who will be listed as the reviewers, you or your advisor, okay? So, and I never done this before. Usually, if I don't feel I have time, I just say, I will reply to the editor or conference organizer by saying, I don't have time, but I know my students have this kind of expertise. If they want them to do, you contact them directly, okay? And anyhow, so being a reviewer is obviously good. It helps you to build up your reputation, okay? But if you just do review for your advisors without getting credits, and that does not help too much. But the problem is how you can ask, okay? I don't know, because my advisor have never done that to me, so I don't know, in this situation what you should do. Anyway, if you have any problems, you need to talk to other people, faculty members here, graduate advisor, coordinator, okay? Collaboration research. So this is pretty much involving working with other people, okay? So problem here is that, well, whenever you have some people from other parties, probably even from the other countries, you need to be aware of the different kind of policies involved, okay? So very often this is responsibilities of your advisor. As a student, you just work on your tasks, okay? But export control is very, very important if collaborators are from another country. That's why if you have a collaborator from another country, you need to discuss data or certain things through email. So that falls into export control domain, okay? You need to be very, very careful. So, and the best practice, I would say, probably you let your advisor deal with this. You do not send the data directly to them, unless, somehow export control has been granted, okay? Of course, the authorship is a very, very tricky part because now you are involving people from other sides, right? And probably from different departments and different cultures. How you can deal with that? Again, your advisor might be a better person to do that, okay? So here, collaboration, again, is a kind of the conflict of interest. It's not just a real, but also potential. And so financially or personally. And one thing I want to emphasize here, and so whenever you got some situations dealing with other parties, and they want you to share something you don't feel comfortable with, always let your advisor to deal with this, okay? And as a student, I don't think you have too much power to deal with that kind of problem. You transfer responsibility to the advisor, okay? And then you don't have to bear the burdens of potential damage, okay? So this is one of the very important things. Communicate with advisors. ISA faculty members are very reasonable, at least from my point of view, okay? And I don't see any case the student is exploited or, mistreated, right? Pretty much, if you have any concerns, talk to advisor, talk to faculty members, we can get the problem resolved. Financial conflicts interest. Okay. Yeah, I mentioned this earlier. Okay, and so nowadays university is very, very strict regarding just declare the conflict of interest every year. Faculty members have to do this, right? And the goal here is that we try to remove or reduce the potential conflict of interest as much as possible, right? For you guys, and we have to think about, the fundings, other things, right? And I have seen very interesting case many years ago in a lab, and the PI got a big grant from a company, and then all his PhD students actually are from that company. So if you look at the paper, nothing went wrong. But if you look at the money and the funding and the profile of all the PhD candidates, that is a flag, okay? Also, after the money is gone and all the students graduated, the lab simply closed, okay? So, and right now you look at that's kind of problem, but early on, somehow people only say, oh, that's kind of interesting, but no one said anything, okay? Okay, so, regarding the financial things, I guess I just say something here very quickly. We have kind of the policy regarding this, right? Even inside the Penn State, when we do grant, we have to settle down all the potential conflicts of interest before we submit the grant. For example, in this case, suppose we have a grant, right, submit to NSF. We must go through a so-called proposal internal approval form. That means university must approve that. In this form, we must declare all kinds of potential interest, conflicts of interest. And more importantly, if you look at this, suppose we have a project collaborated by people from different departments, right? And then we need to declare the credits in the beginning. So who got the 20%, who got 5%. And as you can see here, and this kind of the fiscal responsibility and conflict of interest are very, very sensitive issues. Okay, later we will see a case where there's kind of the mismanagement of the fiscal funds. Okay. Okay, so I need to speed up a little bit, otherwise I cannot finish. So here we talk about money, right? Pretty much we talk about how the money should be spent by the by PIs, your advisors. Of course, this does not concern you directly, but you should know your tuition, if you're RA, right? Your tuition, your RA stipend, and everything is from this kind of research fund, right? And all the funds actually are awarded to the university rather than awarded to your advisor. Your advisor wrote the proposal and then got the money, but it's the university who got the money. Okay, that's why somehow even your advisor cannot use money in the way he or she wants if the costs were not allowed, right? And that's why somehow we have all kinds of regulations, like purchasing regulations. And I can tell you one interesting case. Several years ago, one of the faculty members here was in a conference. Somehow her laptop adapter was broken. Somehow she had to buy one, right? Like 20 or 30 bucks or something. And for some reason, procedure-wise, there was something wrong. And she couldn't get a reimbursement, And we discussed this. Only 20 bucks? And university policy was very strict. No, we cannot allow that happen, okay? Anyway, so for you guys, somehow you say, why should I care about this? I can just tell one thing, okay? So suppose you work on the project, right, with your advisor, but you are paid from another grant, even though you are the first author in that paper. And university policy does not allow you to travel with the money from that grant because you are not supported by that grant. So last year, a student actually came to me asking, what's going on? I cannot go to the conference even though I am the first author, but the other student could. So basically, the other student actually was sponsored by the project, okay? And of course, the arrangement of the funding was made by the advisor, okay? However, university policy prevent from using money to do that, okay? You may say, okay, what if something went wrong? Okay, I can just give you one extreme case. This happened to Penn State. Okay, you can search online. This guy is called Craig Grimes, and he misused 3 million NSF money. And he applied money for trials, experiments. He never used that for that purpose, right? Much of the money was used for his personal expenses. So by the end, he was sentenced to 3.5 years prison time, and he has to repay $600,000 back to the university at NSF. Okay, Penn State had another embarrassing case. An engineering professor somehow got money, NSF money, and then funneled the money to his own company. Okay, that's why now Penn State is very, very serious about complying with the fiscal policies of NSF. That's why sometimes for you guys, you may feel kind of, oh, why is this so strict regarding what cost can be allowed, what cannot, okay? Okay. Okay, let me move this quickly, advising and supervising. So your advisor here is to help you grow up intellectually, okay? And we here are supposed to provide guidance regarding your research, your intellectually development, right? So we should tell you everything regarding data collection, paper writing, everything. But everyone has different styles, right? And someone gave you very, very detailed instructions, but someone let you try and error by yourself, okay? So somehow, my advice here is that you need to know your advisor's style, okay? And so, for example, first year you guys are working, are taking courses, right? And some advisors will say, okay, course is important, and focus on course and find some time to research. But some advisors, no, course is secondary, your research is the key, okay? Somehow different labs have different kind of styles, don't just compare with other labs and say, oh, it's unfair, I have done too much, or I'm too. Okay, so different styles, you should know that. Also, different disciplines are very, very different, okay? Also, some labs, some advisors give you very concrete directions by saying, this is your research project. Go in this direction, don't think about other thing else, okay? But other advisors, including myself, usually I do not tell students what to do. I just said, let yourself explore and let me know what you want, and then I can help you decide what to pick. So some people like the former one, but some people favor the latter one, okay? It really depends. Also, in terms of the research techniques, some people are very hands-on. Oh, no, don't do that. Use this package, use this system. But some people say, do whatever you want, as long as you give me the results, okay? So, working with advisor is very, very important, and knowing the style can help you better working with advisor, okay? Otherwise, your advisor can make your life much happy or much miserable, okay? And find the way to work with an advisor, okay? So in terms of research meetings, every week, know the requirement from your advisor, right? What they want before the meeting, what they expect from the meeting, okay? For example, usually I tell my students, before the meeting, you must write something to me and let me know what you have thought, what you want to discuss. And so I can be prepared. Don't just come to the meeting without anything written before, okay? And also, I'm not the person asking, okay, show me the results, show me the algorithm, so in every meetings. But other labs, some labs do that. Okay, it's a different kind of styles. Also, in terms of paper writings, some advisors only expect the paper, probably 2 days before submission with very, very well written. But some advisors say, no. You need to give me the outline. You need to give me, the manuscript when you finish every major steps. Okay, and so know their styles and understand when to give what kind of the thing to them. Also, eventually you need to find a job, right? Know your advisor's style, and does she or he help the students find a job or not? Okay, and then plan your strategies early on. Okay. Anyway, so this book called "Get What You Came For," I think, is a book talking about how to prepare the graduate school. So there are all kinds of the interesting tips regarding how to work with advisors. Okay. Writing. I want to just emphasize one thing here, right? You can go to academic integrity policies in Penn State, and one thing I want to emphasize is that the plagiarism. Okay, even for graduate students, every year, and I encounter some cases in my class. Sometimes it's quite serious, sometimes it's minor. Okay, and so no matter it's homework or your research papers or your submission, your dissertations, and everything should be written by yourself. Okay, so otherwise potential damage is quite serious, not just to you, probably also to your advisor, even to the whole universities. So nowadays, when you do the TA, you will know this. Probably, we have all kinds of tools like Turnitin. We can easily find out which sentence copied from the other sources, right? And so even if you just copy the paper from another student who took this class before, as long as that paper is in the system, and that practice can be detected. So, okay, and I cannot emphasize more the importance of this matter. Okay, other issues, I think. Conflicts of your advisors, why too much, right? As mentioned earlier, conflicts of your advisors might happen in the future, right? And so always face the reality somehow. And I have seen so many different cases, okay? Sometimes it's just kind of the disagreement on intellectual directions or practices. Sometimes the personality conflicts. And anyway, so usually they can be resolved professionally when you follow the procedures, right? And talk to your graduate coordinator, program director. We can discuss the issues, or if necessary, we can switch advisors. Okay, and usually in ISD we have academic advisor versus research advisor, in particular for master's students. And some PhD students usually they are the same, but for master's students sometimes they can be separated, right? But no matter how, you can always switch. Although my experience that if you switch advisors, the cost is on you, right? You already spend too much time working with this guy. You switch another person, probably topics are very different, styles are very different. It's very challenging, right? And another thing is that when you work as a TARA, usually you need to sign the contract, right? In particular for TA, you need to read the university policies, the ISD policies regarding what you should do, okay? And two things I want to emphasize. First, you must report to your instructor 1 week before the class starts, right? To understand what you should do. Don't wait for the last day to tell your instructor, oh, I'm here, right? Usually, they may want to touch base with you to give you certain tasks, okay? That's one thing. Another thing, in particular for TA, okay? And your responsibility is to work for 20 hours per week. Don't overdo that. If you find out your workload is more than 20 hours, you need to speak out, right? Let the instructor know, that's too much, I cannot handle, okay? you are not supposed to work more than 20 hours. Otherwise, your research will be hurt, okay? If the instructor cannot respond to your request, you need to talk to graduate program director or other people, and then we can find a way to resolve the problem, okay? And so here's as a TA, I want you to know, you contribute the teaching, and then we pay your tuition and provide you financial support, right? But you still need to work on research, okay? And don't spend too much time on teaching. The last thing I want to talk about this is that somehow being a TA, you may interact with students younger than you, or as a student, you may interact with researchers more senior than you, okay? And this kind of romantic relationship can happen on campus, but you gotta be very careful about this, okay? Usually, I told my students is like this. Whenever you are involved with another party, I ask 2 questions. Are you having certain powers on the other side, or does that side have certain power on you? If either answer is yes, you gotta be very careful, okay? Because eventually something may go sour, and then unfortunate cases may be filed, okay? And you know, sex harassment is not something quite rare in universities. Actually, quite often, you gotta be careful, okay? Probably you guys heard about the recent cases. And one is this year, one is the end of last year. The first guy is a Berkeley professor. He was actually resigned. The other guy is a Caltech professor. He was suspended for a year. So they both are accused of somehow treating female students inappropriately, okay? Anyway, so my advice here is that, well, you know, here you want your goals to get a degree, right? Of course, if you find someone significant, that's great, but if power has certain factor in this kind of relationship, you gotta be very careful, okay? And I remember when I was in Michigan somehow, and I had one professor who was in the mathematical department, I guess. He was a professor in Princeton early on. So I was curious why he moved to Michigan from Princeton. Because in mathematics, Princeton is much better than Michigan, right? And you know, my friend is his student, and said, oh, he married his student, right? Then he cannot stay in Princeton. He has to leave, okay? So you know, usually university has this kind of policies, you know, and if certain policies were not followed, and have to pay, right? Anyway, so for the research ethics issues, you know, regarding misconduct and things, you can go to the resource like an NIH or this we call RCREC, right? And Responsible Conduct Research Education Consortium, and you know, there are lots of things, right? Any questions regarding these issues?